Wachilla. My name is Paola Perez Aleman. I'm a professor in the Faculty of Management at McGill University. I would like to start first by acknowledging that McGill University is on land which long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst indigenous peoples, including the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations. We acknowledge and thank the diverse indigenous peoples whose footsteps have marked this territory on which peoples of the world now gather. It is our pleasure to welcome today the Grand Chief of the Cree, Dr. Abel Bosum, and Right Honourable Mr. Paul Martin. I would also like to welcome other guests who are visiting McGill University today. Bill Namagoose, Executive Director of the Cree Nation Government. Paul John Murdoch, Chief Negotiator of the Cree Nation Government. Tina Petawabano, Negotiator of the Cree Nation Government. Bella Petawabano, Chairperson, Cree Board of Health and Social Services of James Bay. Melissa Saganash, Director, Cree-Quebec Relations of the Cree Nation Government. This event is part of the Cree lecture series, the Center for Research on Religious Studies at McGill University. And there have been 4 series so far. One co-organized with the Faculty of Education, another one organized by the Religious Studies faculty, a third one with the Faculty of Law at McGill, and this 4th one is co-organized with the Des Hotels Faculty of Management. And the topic is Indigenous Leadership, Development, and Governance. As we introduce this event, we want to mention 3 points that drive our mission at McGill University and drive the creation of this conversation space. And the 3 points are inclusion, innovation, and community. First, the idea of inclusion in our universities. This entails in-depth exchange, sharing, and co-production of knowledge, increasing and building capacities, bringing different ways of knowing, different ways of seeing. It means openness and engaging and embracing and celebrating our rich diversity in the forums in which we participate and we organize at our university. Second, a central aspect of our mission at McGill centers on the idea of innovation. To innovate, to create new ideas, new knowledge, new products, new inventions. To do innovation, we need to embrace ideas that are currently outside of our university. We need to engage with other communities and foster knowledge flows from widely different places and experiences. Specifically, we need to learn more from indigenous peoples and indigenous communities. Third is the idea of community and how this notion of community affects how we think about leadership, how we think about development, and about governance. Effective organizations and effective management depends on communities. And so on this topic of leadership, development, and governance, and how to create communities, we have much to learn today from our speaker, Dr. Abel Bosum, given his long history of commitment to his people and to creating communities. It is my hope that this will be the start of a conversation of what should be a continued effort in the future to continue our collaborations to bring more justice and equity to our world. This event has been co-organized through a joint effort between different parts of McGill University, including the Center for Research on Religion, the Des Hotels Faculty of Management, the Newman Center of McGill University, and the Center for Indigenous Conservation and Development Alternatives. Now, to introduce our guest today, I'm going to call on Cécile Chabot, who was born in the Omushkego and Eeyou Cree community of Moose Factory to English and French Canadian parents who met on the border between Eeyou, Istchee, and Nunavik in the Quebec Cree and Inuit territories. He grew up in this intercultural context, and which had a profound formative effect on his work, which he has been doing since he left the North for post-secondary studies, including his thesis on the James Bay Cree history. Cecile has been recently appointed director of the Newman Center of McGill and is also a faculty member in Concordia's First People Studies program. Miigwech, Cecile, please.
Thank you, Paula. So as someone who's been deeply influenced from a young age by James Bay Cree role models, teachers, elders, and leaders, it is a great honor and a privilege to introduce our distinguished speakers and moderator for this important conversation on Indigenous leadership, governance, and development, Grand Chief Dr. Abel Bosum, the Right Honourable Paul Martin, and Mr. John Hurley. So our moderator, Mr. John Hurley, is a partner in the Montreal office of Gowling and a leader of the Indigenous law team there. He has worked with the Cree Nation of Eeyou Istchee for about 40 years. Mr. Hurley was introduced to the Cree Nation in the early 1970s during his undergraduate studies in anthropology at McGill University. At the time, the Cree were involved in lengthy legal proceedings and negotiations with Quebec and Canada to oppose the James Bay hydroelectric project and to protect their Aboriginal rights, their environment, and their traditional way of life. After receiving his BA from McGill in 1973, Mr. Hurley worked as a junior research associate on the Cree team negotiating an agreement in principle with Quebec and Canada to settle the James Bay project dispute. It was at that time that he met the Cree leaders and their legal advisors negotiating the James Bay and Northern Quebec Agreement, signed on November 11, 1975, the first modern Indigenous treaty in Canada. This experience led him to decide on a career in law. He obtained his LLL from the University of Montreal in 1977 and was called to the Bar of Quebec in 1978. Mr. Hurley has worked as a lawyer continuously with the Cree Nation of Eeyou Istchee since then on a wide variety of matters, including government relations, regional and local governance, health and social services, education, economic development, energy and natural resources, environmental assessment, taxation, and general commercial matters. He has assisted the Cree Nation in negotiating important governance agreements with Quebec in 2012 and with Canada in 2017. Mr. Hurley obtained a PhD in law from the University of Cambridge in 1987. The Right Honourable Paul Martin was Prime Minister of Canada from 2003 to 2006 and Minister of Finance from 1993 to 2002. During his tenure as Minister of Finance, he raised Canada's deficit, subsequently recording 5 consecutive budget surpluses, and set Canada's debt to GDP ratio on a steady downward track. He was the co-founder of the Finance Ministers G20, and in September 1999 was named its inaugural chair. During his tenure as Prime Minister, Mr. Martin introduced a 10-year plan to improve health care and reduce wait times, signed agreements with the provinces and territories to establish the first national early learning and childcare program, and created a new financial deal for Canada's municipalities. Under his leadership, the Canadian government reached an historic deal with Aboriginal people of Canada to eliminate the existing funding gaps in health, education, and housing, and that deal was known as the Kelowna Accord. After leaving politics, Mr. Martin founded the Martin Family Initiative, focusing on the early childhoods and elementary and secondary education of Indigenous children and youth. The mission of FMI is to walk alongside Indigenous experts, communities, and leaders to improve educational opportunities from birth through to secondary school for Indigenous children in Canada. Before entering politics, he had a distinguished career as chairman and chief executive officer of the CSL Group, Inc. Grand Chief Dr. Abel Bosum is Grand Chief and Chairman of the Grand Council of the Crees, Eeyou Istchee, Cree Nation government. After leaving Latuke Indian Residential School, and after working in underground mines in the Chibougamau area, Abel Bosum began his serious career and life's work by working for the Grand Council of the Crees of Quebec in 1978, where he occupied numerous roles in the area of economic development. From 1984 to 1998, Abel Bosum occupied the key leadership role of the Ojibwe Cree Nation, his home community, which had been displaced numerous times in order to accommodate the mining industry. He coordinated and supervised legal and historical research, supervised and conducted successful negotiations leading to major agreements with both Quebec and Canada related to the establishment of a permanent village for the Crees of Ojibwe. He then led the community in the planning and construction of a unique new village, which is noted for its culturally based architecture, a locally developed and self-sufficient housing program, and a village-wide alternative energy system. Ojibwe has received significant national and international recognition for its community development achievements, including awards from the United Nations, participation in the World Fair, Expo 2000, and has been subject of numerous documentaries, newspaper and magazine articles highlighting the community's achievements and Abel Bosum's leadership. From 1999 to 2017, Abel Bosum served the Grand Council of the Crees, Eeyou Istchee, as negotiator for Cree-Quebec relations. In that capacity, he represented the Cree Nation in historic negotiations, which put the relationship between the Cree Nation and the province of Quebec on a new footing and laid the foundation for the long-term positive development of the Cree communities. This milestone new relationship agreement between the Cree Nation and the government of Quebec, La Paix des Braves, signed in 2002, has established a new benchmark for the resolution of conflicts between Aboriginal nations and governments. Building on the foundation laid by the Paix des Braves, the Cree Nation undertook equally groundbreaking negotiations with Quebec in the area of governance. Abel Bosum led the negotiations aimed at providing a much more significant role for the Cree Nation in the governance of the entire northern region of Quebec, while at the same time establishing a unique regional government comprised of representatives of Cree and non-Indigenous communities in the region. The Cree-Quebec Governance Agreement has resulted in greater jurisdiction of the Cree Nation over its traditional territory, while providing a voice for all residents of the territory. In recognition of his extensive skills and talents in the areas of community development, negotiations, and political strategy development, the people of the Cree Nation of Eeyou Istchee in 2017 elected Abel Bosum to serve as their Grand Chief, the highest elected position in the Cree Nation. Abel Bosum and his wife Sophie have 4 children and numerous grandchildren. When the opportunity presents itself, Abel's greatest joy is to take his family to their cabin on the Ojibwe traditional territory. Now, the format for this event will be as follows. The Grand Chief will open with a short overview of recent Cree history. We will then proceed to a conversation with Mr. Martin, moderated by Mr. Hurley. We will then conclude with a question period, and I would ask you to please use the mics on the aisles for that. Thank you.
Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for coming to join us this afternoon on what promises to be a really fascinating and engaging discussion between Grand Chief Abel Bosum and Mr. Martin. So kind of you all to be here, and kind of the Grand Chief and Mr. Martin to take the time for this discussion. So we're in for a real treat this afternoon, and we're going to start with a presentation by the Grand Chief, who's put together a really very nice overview. It's 10 slides, and I think it'll get the ball rolling very nicely. So, Grand Chief, over to you.
Olha, nós como não tínhamos que dizer agora, de doxinianot, de hidrat, nós como agora temos de inhibitar de babhanot, etc. First, I want to acknowledge the Algonquin, the Snabi Nation. Thank them for allowing us to have this event on their traditional territory. What I'm going to do is, with these slides, put into context, give you a little bit of context of where the Cree come from. And perhaps through that presentation, will give you a sense of what the Cree have gone through. So here, we're going to be celebrating 350th anniversary, first contact with the Hudson Bay. In one of our Cree communities, Waskaganish, also known as Rupert's House. And the reason I bring that up is because the Cree people are very connected to the land. And this map here shows the water basins that flow into James Bay. Those were our highways. Those were the highways that our people used to navigate in and out. And those are the rivers they used to trade with Hudson Bay. And so the notion of partnership began back then. The Cree thought it was an equal partnership. They provided for Hudson Bay, and Hudson Bay, of course, got rich and wealthy and spread across Canada. And so the Cree also felt that they were also part of that development. They were part of building the nation right across Canada. And so the notion of partnership is very important. And once I talk about our treaty, and the notion of partnership is also very important when we talk about treaties right across Canada, because that's what our people saw these treaties to be: partnership, sharing in the resources and in the land. What many people maybe don't quite understand is that after many years of this partnership, in 1970, there was an announcement to build the biggest hydroelectric project in the north. This announcement was a shock. It shocked our people. Our people, 70%, 80% of our people were living off the land. When the project was announced, they had no idea what it was about. All they saw were planes coming in, helicopters, roads being built. That was a shock for a lot of our people. Fortunately, we had some young people who were down south studying in the universities. And they picked up the paper and heard on the radio of this big project that was going to be built up north on the Istchee, and that was going to flood a big part of the territory. And so they were commissioned. They were told to go home. They met with the leaders, and they explained what they had learned in the papers about this project. And together, the leaders at the time and these young students, they were probably anywhere between 18 and 22, they went home. They sacrificed their education to go back and to help their people. So we had no choice. We had to do something. And so here you see the picture here of young men up north. These were sort of the students. Some of the meetings were gathered in the schools that we had to explain the project. Of course, you see right in the middle, you have the elders. You can just tell by their faces, the expression on their faces, that this project was going to change their way of life. And down here, these are the leaders: Grand Chief Billy Diamond, Philip Oashis, Abel Kitchen, Ted Moses, Robert Kanadwat. And they gathered the people to explain what the project would do and what we needed to do. And of course, the first reaction was to go to court. There was an injunction filed. It stopped the project. A few weeks, of course, the province filed an appeal. They won. And then the project was allowed to proceed. And that's what started the discussions or the negotiations leading to the James Bay Northern Quebec Agreement. Now, the James Bay Agreement was signed in 1975. There was 1 year to negotiate the agreement in principle, 1974, and then another year, 1973, and then another year to negotiate the treaty itself. Very short, very intense period. You don't see that today. You don't see that type of negotiations. So you can, by understanding that, you can see that the pressure that was put on the leaders, on the people, to make a decision about the future, about their future. Of course, and many of you may know that often agreements are signed, people get their way, the governments got their deal, Hydro got a project, Canada also resolved some land issues that it had with Canada, with Quebec, and there was nobody there to implement the agreement. Of course, the Cree were very upset. Here was a treaty that promised them better living conditions, better facilities, but nothing was happening. It was the same thing, same programs coming into the communities. Over the years, though, there were a number of other obstacles. Besides, the refusal of governments to recognize Eeyou rights, there was also the refusal to implement the agreement. Both governments offered what they called normal programs that everybody else got. Now, why would we sign a treaty if we were getting something that everybody else had? Didn't make sense. And there were other projects being announced, more hydroelectric projects. And we fought hard to get Cree consent. And of course, the notion of Cree consent was very difficult to accept because the government said, well, we've already signed a treaty. We've already extinguished your rights. So why would we need more, why we need consent from you? Then, of course, there was the Quebec secession. Quebec wanted to break away from Canada. Of course, the Cree had to take a position. They had to decide whether they were going to be part of this or not. And the Cree chose not to. They had their own referendum where 95% of the people decided to stay in Canada. And that was during that period, the first 20-year period. Then, of course, we had forestry disputes. Forestry was never very clear in our agreement. And so there was industries were just cutting large areas, destroying the environment. They were just allowed to do that. Of course, that also resulted in a number of other court cases. We had over 30 court cases to enforce the agreement, to make sure that our rights were respected. And then, of course, we had to take the issue to the international level. We went to UN, complained at the UN. And that's how we became also involved in working on the UN Declaration on Indigenous rights. Now here's an interesting quote by late Billy Diamond. He said, "Great obstacles make great leaders." And it's true. It's when you're pressured to do something that you're going to react, and out of it, you're going to mobilize people. And I think that one of the greatest strengths of the Cree has been the unity. Whenever there was an issue, they came together. Yes, we have our internal issues that we dispute, but when it's time to work together, the unity is very strong. So it wasn't until 2001, this is what we call the turning point. This was restoring relationship. At this point in time, in 2001, it was all confrontation. There was no communication between the Cree and the governments. We were about to give up, scrap the agreement, scrap the treaty. But there was a meeting between former Premier Bernard Landry and Grand Chief Ted Moses. Went head to head. It was quite an intense meeting. And there the two gentlemen agreed to sit down and see what they can come up with. And so the parties went their ways, and a few weeks later we came together to identify the issues that we thought were important to restore the relationship. And again here, the negotiations were very short. Think about 6 months, the agreement in principle, and then the final agreement. So this was sort of the first nation-to-nation agreement that was characterized by cooperation and partnership again, and mutual respect. Now, of course, we know that the big issue in the territory is resource development. The land is rich with resources. And here's a map of what you see up here, and these lines coming down. This is the James Bay Hydroelectric Project. These are the reservoirs that flow, and all the dams are here. 50% of Quebec's energy comes from Eeyou, Istchee. Down here in the yellow, it's all the forestry. Note we have 5 communities that are heavily impacted by forestry. The Pays Brave, which I'll explain a little bit, tried to resolve some of that dispute that we had with the forest industry. And then you have in boxes all the mines. There's all kinds of mineral. Right now, we have one of the largest gold mines operating, Eleanor. There's a diamond mine to the east over here in Istchee. There's lithium mines ready to be developed. There's iron ore. There's rare earth. All kinds of potential. So you can see the pressure on the land, the pressure on the people, the pressure on wildlife, pressure on the way of life of the Cree people. And so we went from negotiating an agreement with the government of Quebec on economic development. The Pays Brave was really about economic development. And then the Pays Brave agreement triggered negotiations with the federal government. Thanks to some innovative people in the federal government who were also looking for a solution on how to implement Canada's obligations under the James Bay Northern Quebec Agreement. The negotiators concluded an agreement in 2008. And in 2008, there were a transfer of certain federal responsibilities to the Cree Nation, along with some funding to do it. This agreement, I should say that while we were negotiating Petit Bras, we didn't know there was another set of negotiations happening. And this was negotiations, I'm going to go back a bit. There were negotiations happening with the people in the region. These were mayors and other politicians in the region. And originally, there was a large municipality called the Municipality of La Baie James. It's a Crown corporation that was operated by the government. It was a Crown corporation by the government, and they appointed the people. But what they did is they signed an agreement and made the mayors the board of directors of that municipality and excluded the Cree. Right after, in between this period, right after 2009, of course, Jean Charest got elected, and he was promoting Plan Nord, project for the North. And so our former Grand Chief, Matthew Kunkam, met with the Premier, and he said, there'll be no Plan Nord if we don't fix governance in the territory. And so that took some time. And then the Premier Charest agreed to have those negotiations. And those negotiations led to this governance agreement where the Cree extended their jurisdiction from 5,000 square kilometers to 70,000. And then we created a regional government with equal representation in the Cree people and the Jamaisians. These are the people that live in our territory. And that has been functioning pretty well up to now. There was some unfinished business in the 2008 agreement with the federal government, so negotiations continued. And then just this past summer, they concluded an agreement to finalize those. This agreement is going through a parliament. We're hoping that the parliament will pass it and become effective before the end of the fiscal year. But this agreement gives the people, the Cree people, more responsibilities. We've assumed greater responsibility. And once passed, we will be sitting down to develop our own constitution that will set the rules on how we govern our people. And rather than having bylaws, there'll be laws. They'll be forcible for both provincial and federal jurisdictions. So we'll have our own government. On the land base. So you can see 1975, the only jurisdiction we had were these red spots. It's what we call Category 1A, 1B. They're like reserve lands. So you can see that the objective back then was to reduce the involvement of the Cree people to these very tiny places, the spots on this territory. and allowing the rest of the territory to be developed by the industry. That was the intent. The agreements, of course, changed it. So here, now the Cree have exclusive jurisdiction Category 1 and Category 2. That's the 70,000 or 75,000 square kilometers that I was referring to earlier. And then on this area here, this is the 55th parallel, but below this is where we have what we transformed what was the original municipality of Baie James. We transformed it into what we called the Eeyou Istchee James Bay Regional Government. And this is where the Cree and the Tsimshian sit together. And that is roughly 300,000 square kilometers. So what the Cree have done is gone from a place where they were just in their own little reserves to now in an environment where they're involved in governance of the whole territory. There are still some areas here to be discussed. See our Inuit friends here. There's still unfinished business. And we'll come to those. I'm sure somebody's going to ask a question. And so I guess, the question then is also how is this implicated with the implementing the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People? The Cree people have been involved in this effort going way back to 1990 or so, 95 maybe. And we've been working to try to push it. And of course, we're very proud now to have Romeo Saginash, who's a Cree NDP, who's pushing for a legislation to have Canada recognize the NDRIP. So here, basically, we're urging Canada to adopt a legislation framework. Why? Because we want them to acknowledge the declaration, want them to put in place the mechanisms for ongoing life with respect to Canada's laws and policies, is to ensure that it cannot be undone by future governments. Because if the government only acknowledges it, that's all it'll be. It'll never be an instrument, to use in courts. And we believe that this would change the paradigm and shift the thinking of what's possible in the future. So this is a very quick overview of where we've come from, what we think of the agreements, our treaty. It's a partnership. We think we should be benefiting from resource development, and we have put in place a number of policies and regimes to help us do that. And then, of course, governance, very important, having an important role in governance in the territory. Agora, Igor.
Well, thank you, Grand Chief. That was sort of a master class in Indigenous law and development and governance over the past 40 years. And no exams. Pass, fail. Everyone passes on this one. But listening to you speak, the connection between development, leadership, and governance just becomes so crystal clear, You're talking about the negotiation of the James Bay Agreement back in 1975, and one of those photos, I don't know if we can call it back up, Dan, of the young leaders. So if we look at the bottom left hand there, I think we've got another photo here. This one here. So we see here in the back, there's Ted Moses. Yeah. The point that I'm trying to make is that these people were, as Abel says, between 18, 22, 25. There were one or two who were a bit older, in their 30s and 40s. But the fact is that here are people who came out of secondary school, and virtually all of them, I guess, have been to residential school, right? So here is a cadre of young people who are thrust into really extraordinary leadership positions with extraordinary pressures on them to deliver the goods. And they've got the fate of their peoples in their hands. There they are. Yeah, let's stabilize it there. Okay. Philip Awashis, Ted Moses, Abel Kitchen, Robert Kanatawat, Billy Diamond, and Smalley Petawabano from Mistissini in the back there. You see the elders in the back. But the people who were on the front lines, in the trenches, were the ones that we see there. And there you've got, by the way, we have former Grand Chief's sister, Bella Petawabano, with us, and his niece, Tina, with us this afternoon. So here you have people who are, you know, they've been to residential school, they've been away from their communities for some time. Whoops, in 1970, they read about this project. No one's consulted the Crees. No one has said, buy your leave. And all of a sudden, the airplanes start coming, and the helicopters are coming in, and mayhem is taking place on the land. And these people are drafted into these leadership positions. Abel, how did it feel like? I mean, I know you weren't negotiating it, but you've spoken with these people. You know what the experience must have been like. What was it like?
Am I on? Well, I can't really say what they felt, but certainly a lot of pressure put on them because they were expected to provide the advice to the elders. Of course, the elders, they had no clue about the cities. They had no clue about industries. Of course, no clue about Hydro-Quebec. And so they were responsible in providing advice. And so they had to grow up, they had to mature very fast. They had to learn the various trades. They had to quickly become the lawyers, the engineers, the architects, and learn what the impact was. They had to learn quickly to be the environmentalists. So they could explain just what the impact can be.
You mentioned that at the time, 70 or 80% of the Cree were still living a traditional way of life in the bush. Can you describe that way of life for us a little bit?
Well, it began with the Hudson Bay, the fur trade, and the Cree would go in the bush on the trap lines. You'll see the map. The whole territory is divided into like 400 family territories. Every family has a territory, and that's where they harvest their game. And so the end of the summer, people would leave their communities and travel through the rivers and lakes and portages, and they would begin, first of all, to scout the territory, their areas, to see where the game were. And this was a way of planning for their winter. And once they had an idea of what kind of resources were on their territory, then they would start to build their camps. And of course, they built their camps with natural resources, wood, moss, spruce bough, so forth. They would spend the whole winter in these camps, trapping. And when the spring came, and they would have there's a different season for harvesting fowl. They would go goose hunting. And when the lakes and rivers thawed out, then they would head back to the community, back to the post, and they would then trade their fur for supplies with the Hudson Bay Company.
So you're describing a way of life which had been going on for centuries before the James Bay project was announced. In 1970-75, most Cree over the age of 30 wouldn't have spoken English or French, right?
Well, those who went to the English residential schools speak English, and now it's probably the majority. I think there was only one community, Wasanape, whose students went to French. Of course, at that time, it was the churches that determined basically which schools these students would be going. So most of the communities were under the Anglican missionary, and so they went to English residential schools. And there was, I think, a Catholic church in Wasanape, and that was the only community of students that went to a French school.
Switching to you, Mr. Martin, how does this story strike you, and does it resonate with you at all? How did you first meet First Nations people?
Well, the story certainly resonates. There's no doubt about that. I was born and raised in Windsor, Ontario. I'm sure we talk about the great cities: London, Paris, Rome, Windsor, Ontario. In any event, if you lived in Windsor, Ontario, then or now, the chances that you would meet somebody from the First Nations would be virtually nil. But I had a series of summer jobs when I was in university, and a number of them were up north. And the one that really registered the most with me was that even today, all of the major transportation of cargo in the Northwest Territories is done on the Mackenzie River by tug barge. And I got a job on a tug barge one summer while I was going to university. And all of the people that I worked with, all the guys, because they were all guys that I worked with, my age, this is 18, 19, 20, were either First Nations, Dene, or they were from the Métis Nation, or they were Inuit. And so what you've got is a whole bunch of young guys on these tug barges. And many times when we couldn't get into a port, these tug barges would just pull up against the shores. And you could have 10, 15 of them. And we all worked together. We all got to know each other very well. We worked together 24 hours. We were together 24 hours, 7 days a week. And of course, this was in the land of the midnight sun, so there was not a lot of sleep. So what happens, you work together. Most of you who know young men of 18, 19, 20, conversation isn't particularly profound. But every so often, we would just get together and we would start to talk about the differences between us and what life was all about. And it was very clear to me that these guys were every bit as intelligent, as hardworking, as fun as anybody I had at home. But there was a melancholy. There was just something that it wasn't quite the same, and I never understood what it was. And I didn't learn from them. I learned an enormous amount from them. The Grand Chief has talked about the land. Those of you who are studying here know full well that most of us in the West are the descendants of the Greeks, the Romans, the great agricultural societies, and that we are superior to nature. We are above nature. Nature is our plaything. And that was certainly the underlying philosophy that I had. But in talking to these people, this was not the case. We were part of nature, and the differences were huge. And we would discuss this, and this would stay with me, but that melancholy stayed with me later. And it wasn't until I ran into one of them about 20 years later that I first heard of the residential schools, and I began to understand where that melancholy came from. And it was at that point that I said, I just cannot believe that my country has done this. I cannot believe that this was going on. you know, just to go back to it, as I said, I was from Windsor. Young people my age who stayed in Windsor got very heavily involved in the civil rights marches of the United States at that time. I was involved. Never crossed my mind that in my country, that the kinds of things that occurred in the residential schools would occur. And it's ever since then. That's really where it began. Just the sheer unfairness of what happened just stayed with me, and I basically said there's going to come a point in my life when I'm going to be able to do something about it. And
I read a comment that you made in a newspaper interview saying that when you were catching up with some of your barge colleagues years later, some of them had done well, more had not done well, some were in jail, and a couple had committed suicide. And
Yeah.
it seems to have had quite an effect on you.
well, it did. The suicide, I mean, these are people that I really knew very well. I've kept contact with some of them, but not others. And when I asked about this one young guy he was just smart as a whip. I mean, there was no doubt in my mind if I had to pick the one who was really going to succeed among all of us, it was him. And he committed suicide. And yeah, there's no doubt that that's when I decided there's something far more important for me to do in life than what I'm doing.
But it stayed with you all
All my
these
life.
years.
Yeah,
Yeah.
still is there.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, we'll come back to that. But at the time that you're talking about these young people on the barge, 20-year-olds raising hell, we go back to the photo of the Cree leaders about the same age who are not raising hell. At this point, they're really feeling the pressure, right? Abel, you yourself, as a young man, were called upon to do something quite extraordinary. Abel sort of glossed over it in his presentation, but tell us about the story of Ujay and how they were left out of the James Bay Agreement.
Well, I can go back, I guess, to in the 60s. It was the first time that our people had contact with white people. And they were prospectors. And our elders would welcome them and guide them. They were looking for rock. And a trapper, I mean, he thought these guys were kind of funny, looking for rock. And so they helped them, and there were some outcrops, actually some gold sticking right out of the ground. And of course, as a result of that, there was a gold rush in Shibumo. And roads were built. As soon as the road was built, forestry operations began, mines were set up, and of course then our people who were the original partners left the site. And that was about the same time that I experienced the residential school. I was 5 years old. I was going to a community, Istchee, thinking that this was sort of a normal trip for me to be with my parents. And when I was in Istchee, one evening, my parents gave me a bag, brand new clothes. Never had new clothes in my life. So it was really something. And I thought, oh, this is very special. So my mother had me try on my clothes, and they fitted. Of course, I'm walking around proud. And then she told me, take them off for an event tomorrow. And so I was told to go to bed early. And so I did. And the next morning, I put on my new clothes thinking that this would be the greatest day of my life. And then I heard a plane circle the community. It landed, it was a float plane. And my stepfather said, well, it's time to go down, with the other people. And I could see other children. Others were dressed up as well. And when we got to the dock, there was the pilot, and there was another white person there calling out names. And they called my name, and I looked around, and my mother was gone. And I knew that something was wrong. My father-in-law picked me up, put me inside the plane, kissed me, put me inside the plane, and I was inside the plane and I couldn't get out. And that was my first experience, and I was sent off to Brantford. My first year was in Brantford. When I came home that summer, our people had relocated, and I wasn't sure what was this relocation about. And our elder said, well, we just happened to be on an area, ore reserve. And there's a company that's coming, they've staked the area, and they're going to build a mine. So they moved our people. We relocated. And this was like in the 70s and then of course shortly after that, the announcement of the big hydroelectric project. And our chief at the time, Jimmy Mianskim, he made an effort to be part of the negotiations to ensure that there was a community for our people. And of course, a land set aside similar to what the other Cree communities were receiving. But that didn't happen. You know, the negotiators, Quebec and Canada, said it was too complicated to try to negotiate a land base for your community. In hindsight, of course, you knew that the whole area had resources, and the only reason why the government didn't want to recognize us was to pave way for development. And so the UJ were not signatories. We weren't recognized under the James Bay Agreement. We were lumped in with another community. We were registered onto this other community in order to maintain our beneficiary. And so it took some years before we finally realized what had just happened. And so after 7 years with the Grand Council, I decided to go home and work with the people and try to understand their history. And it took about 10 years, a lot of lobbying, a lot of trying to convince, of course, both sides of government. When I started, I wrote a letter to both governments, and I asked that we set up a table. And so I get a letter first from the federal government. The Minister of Indian Affairs says, well, if you can secure land, we will sit down with you and we'll negotiate with Quebec. Shortly after that, I get a response from Quebec saying, well, if you get recognition, then we'll sit down and we'll talk about land. Catch-22. And so one event, former Grand Chief Ted Moses invited me to attend this convention, the PQ convention. And so he says, let's try it. Let's try to get close to René Lévesque. Well, let's see what he can do. And so we're in this hall, and of course at that time, there were no non-smoking signs anywhere, so you could the environment was full of smoke, and we're pushing our way in, and right in the middle, here's René Lévesque, small little guy. Anyway, so I had an opportunity, I had 5 minutes to explain who we were, what we wanted, and so forth. And I told him the letter I got from the federal government. And of course he's smoking away, he looks at me, and he says, okay, we're going to fix that. So that was it, that was our meeting. About a month later, I get a letter from the Premier, and he said, the government of Quebec is ready to grant you 1 square kilometer for your community. So we looked at that letter, and I got the community together, the members, the elders were there, and we said, what do we do? I mean, this isn't going to, how are we going to build a community on 1 square kilometer? But in the wisdom of the elders, they said, take it. The federal government has challenged us to get a land. You got it, take it. And so I wrote back to the premier and said, we accept. And then that forced Canada to come to the table. So we sat down, had the tripartite agreement, and in 1989, we signed the first agreement with Quebec, and 2 years later with the federal government.
Abel, you make it sound so easy. But it wasn't quite that easy, was it? No. It was like 10 years of pitched battle, trench warfare, blockades of roads. This was really Moses in the form of Abel leading his people through the desert, to the promised land. It was just an extraordinary exercise in leadership. So hats off. Mr. Martin, you've talked about you can't avoid doing the right thing forever. Talking about our relations with Indigenous people. This is Mr. In an interview with CBC on the House. The two most important social and economic issues that we face as a country, that's to say the relationship between Indigenous to non-Indigenous Canadians on the one hand, and the need for social programs that fundamentally face up to the fact that Indigenous Canadians are the youngest and fastest growing segment of our population. We've been living with the consequences of not living up to these issues now for the past 150 more years. Look, you can't avoid doing the right thing forever. Are we moving towards doing the right thing, do you think?
Yeah, although when I listen to the Grand Chief and you think how long things took, in the 1960s, there was a realization that the residential schools were a mistake, to understate the issue. The last residential school was closed in 1993. It was a mistake, and they took 33 years in which to do it. But we blame the residential schools for everything, and the residential schools were just a god-awful thing. But the fact is that since the 1960s to today, including today, we underfund education, we underfund healthcare, we underfund child welfare, all of the basic social programs that everyone else in this room grew up depending on. We provided the First Nations with roughly 40 to 50% of that cost. And so if you wonder why, as an example, that 50% of all the children today in foster homes are Indigenous, it's pretty clear why that is the case. It's because of this.
Can I just stop you there for a moment?
Yeah.
Repeat that for us. 50% of the children in foster care are Indigenous?
Yeah, in the province of Manitoba, the number right now is rising above 80%.
And Indigenous people across the country represent something like 4 or 5% of the total population?
4 or 5% of the population.
So we're talking about 10 times overrepresentation of children in foster care.
Yeah, look at there's no use trying to hide. There's no use trying to hide from it, which is one of the reasons that I created the foundation, one of the reasons that we're doing the kinds of things that we are doing, and that there is a huge, and since the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, there is a change of attitude. And what we've really got to do now is to build on that change of attitude. And I believe that if we do it, we can. I'm going to just go to your 2 points where you quoted me. There is no doubt that the single most important social issue that we face as a country really comes down to Indigenous One of the truth, it is Indigenous people, but more than anything else, it is Indigenous babies. There's a Cindy Blackstock, who is somebody that many of you have heard about. Cindy, I think she's got there's a tremendous quote, and she says that one of the issues that the Indigenous people face is that they spend most of their adult lives compensating for their childhood. And that is an accurate statement, and I think is an indication of the social issue. But then to go to what you just said about the age issue, for the first time in Canadian history, there are more people over the age of 65 in this country than there are under the age of 15. Now, and so what does that mean to all of you? Well, it means if more people over the age of 65, take a look. This is the future of Canada. God, give it up if that's the case. You know, but at the same time, given that we've got this young population, the youngest and the fastest growing segment of our population are Indigenous Canadians. So then take a look and just simply make the calculation. You got all of these old people, you and me. Well, I just wanted to get you into this. What the hell? And you've got this tremendous body of young people, as you say, 4% of the population. Well,
I burst in with another one of your statistics, by the way. You said that half of the people under the age of 15 are Indigenous. Something I didn't realize.
I don't know if the number of half the ones under, but it's certainly the youngest and the fastest growing segment of that. Now, if you want to know the economic issue that we face, it is that you've got, as you mentioned, 4% of the population are Indigenous. Don Drummond, who was a very senior officer in the Department of Finance when I had done, came out with a study about a month ago. And what he has essentially said, given the fact that we've got this aging population over here, and we're not reproducing enough of ourselves, and that it's really is Indigenous people that are doing it, he has said that if Indigenous people were get the same level of education that other Canadians get over the course of the next 25 years, that 4% will represent over 20% of the Canadian workforce. That means doctors, lawyers, engineers, scientists. We are a country of 34 million people in competition with countries with populations 300 million to 1 billion people. And if you think that 34 million people can afford to waste the youngest and the fastest growing segment of your population, undereducate them, under-hospitalize them, just take away their potential future, then, well, I'm sure none of you think that, but that is what we have done as a country. And so there's no time to waste. And this can be turned around. And we've shown that it can be turned around. And it's just a question of getting on with it.
Here, getting on with it. Abel, you've given us your presentation at the beginning of the conversation, and we see, you've also just described where Ujibugamo was in the 1970s, right? And I remember my first encounter with the Cree. I had just graduated from McGill in 1973, which still makes me in a first flush of youth. And I was sent up by Dick Salisbury of the Department of Anthropology to Matagami. Matagami was the jumping off point for the James Bay project. So that's where the road started and the rail line ended. So all of the goods were transshipped onto trucks and then sent up. So it was the Wild West. And he sent me up to do a little assignment there. There was Wampanoag Cree who were there. And I remember, it's hard to believe now. I mean, we don't have the photos of the Cree communities up now, but if you visit the Cree communities, you'll see that they have really quite good community facilities, housing, infrastructure, schools, police stations, the whole 9 yards. So the contrast between the Cree of today and the Cree of then could not be starker. In 1973, the Cree of Waswanipi, there was a little settlement on the margin of town, on wasteland, next to an industrial park. And you had maybe 15, 20 tent frames at the time. there were no services. There was no electricity, there was no running water. Tent frame is half plywood and then a canvas roof. You had maybe 20 of these tent frames in the community, and in each of those tent frames you had 10, 12 people within maybe 200 square feet, 100 square feet. It was third world conditions. And if I'm not wrong, the people of Ujjayi were living in the same conditions, right? So what we've seen is just a complete reversal of fortunes. And when people think of the Cree now, often they think of the Cree as, quote unquote, the rich Indians of the East. But the fact is that the Cree were anything but rich in the 1970s, right? It was really on the margins. So can you describe a little bit how it is that the Cree have got from there to here? It may be difficult to do it in a few words, but over 40 years we've just seen a complete reversal of fortune. What role does leadership play in that?
Well, I think we have to go back to the treaty itself. You know, a lot of people, when there's an agreement signed, when there's a treaty, the big news is always about the money. For the Cree, it was never about the money. What you found in the James Bay Agreement are processes, and these are the processes that we eventually utilized once we got the governments to the table to discuss the implementation. And so, of course, you know, our leaders between 1975 until 2001 were sort of the militants. They had to fight. It was just a constant struggle just to push open up the agreement or to get anything out of it. And then after the petty brav, the idea was about finding solutions. How do we find solutions, you know, from everything from how can the governments implement their obligations, and so it was up to the leadership then to find solutions and bring them to the table, because the other side wasn't going to come with any solutions. And so that's basically the role they had.
So you're talking about process and the importance of process in making things happen. You showed us on the map that progression from the little red dots to the bigger pink splotches of territory, and from 5,000 square kilometers to 70,000 square kilometers to 375 square kilometers. It's kind of an illustration of the Cree incremental approach. Would you say that's a fair statement? But we could also see, perhaps, that the story of Ujjayi is, in its own way, the Cree incremental approach, right? You start from 1 square kilometer to a community now which is recognized by UNESCO as a heritage site. It's really quite an extraordinary sort of story. You nod your head, you make it look so easy. It ain't quite so easy. And someone who could tell us about that, but perhaps that's another conversation, is Bill Namagoose, who's in the room with us today. Bill is the executive director of the Grand Council and the Cree Nation government, and he's been in that position for 25 years, which leads me to my next point when we talk about leadership. The Cree have been extraordinarily blessed in their leadership. Would you agree with that statement?
Yes, I think we've had only 4 leaders since 1974, when Billy was elected, and I'll be the 5th one. And I think that a big part of it has to do with the fact that we realized that we were on an important mission, to ensure that the Cree rights were being respected. We were always observant of what was happening in the territory. because any kind of development would impact the territory. And we had to look for opportunities. Whenever there was an opportunity, political opportunity or any other opportunity, we seized that to advance our own mission.
Just to make a point, you asked the Grand Chief about, okay, but you had a lot of money, and wasn't that it? And the Chief said, well, money didn't hurt, but it was really the management. It was really our ability to run our own show. It's really important. It is really important to understand that. Look, you're not going to have an education system without money, and you're not going to have a healthcare system without money, and that goes without saying. And there's no doubt that after, when the final negotiations closed, the Cree did have money, but that, it wasn't just the money. What really happened is what I think is what the Grand Chief is talking about. The fact is that the Cree had the ability to make their own decisions. They had the ability to run their own show. They didn't have to look over their shoulders to somebody, and they didn't have to go and ask permission from somebody. They basically said, this is this is the problem that we face. This is what we're going to do. Now, that does not exist for the vast majority of other First Nations communities in the country. The fact is that if they want to get 50 cents, they've got to go to Ottawa, and they have to explain to Ottawa in agonizing detail why, in fact, they've got to spend the 50 cents there as opposed to where they really want to spend it, because this is where the benefit is. And so what the Cree did is, when they got the flexibility of the money, they ran their own show. And that is really got to be part of the answer that we're talking about.
Well, point very well taken, Mr. Martin. If we think about the James Bay Agreement, there are 30 chapters in the James Bay Agreement, and there's one chapter that deals with money, and the rest deals with things like land, protection of the environment, hunting, fishing, trapping rights, and Cree institutions. Cree institution, very important. So Cree Health Board, we have the chair with us today, Bella Petawabano. Cree School Board, Cree Nation Government, etc. So from the get-go, the Cree saw the importance of having their own institutions. We're talking about governance, right? The Cree got right onto it.
We have a program in Mistissini, a business program, and Lucy Sandor was right here as the person who's in charge of the overall thing. And so we deal with the Cree School Board. I can tell you right now, we deal with, there are school boards right across this country, non-Indigenous school boards. And the Cree School Board is as good as any group of educators that I have seen.
Hear, hear. Abel, coming back to some of the agreements that you talked about, what strikes me is how quickly they were done. Why was that? If we look at land claim negotiations in Canada right now, we know that it's an industry primarily for lawyers and consultants, right? Because these agreements take 20, 30 years, if ever, to reach a conclusion. How is it that the Cree were able to do these agreements so quickly?
Well, I mentioned that we look for opportunities. I mentioned the case on Plan Nord. That was something that the government wanted to do, and former Grand Chief met with the Premier and insisted on a table. Of course, when you are in those situations, there are timetables to respect in order to come up with an agreement. And so in that case, it was a 6-month period in which we set out to negotiate. So just the pressure of concluding was something that drove us to find solutions as quickly as we can. Mind you, we just don't think of them like that. We have many assemblies every summer where we consult with our people. We talk about what's important and so forth. And so when it's time to negotiate, we're pretty well informed of what's needed. And so it's just a question of pressuring the other side to meet the schedules that we do set out.
So our themes this afternoon are development, leadership, and governance. And the example you've just given makes the link very nicely between development and governance, right? The Grand Chief at the time, Matthew Kumkum, told Premier Charest, look, you're interested in development of the North. You have your Plan Nord. There will be no Plan Nord until such time as the Cree get a fair deal on governance. That means the negotiation of the governance agreement. Do you respond to that, Mr. Martin, coming as a former Prime Minister and Minister, that one has to set a tight time frame to get things done?
Not much doubt about it, given the fact that I lost an election. But, you know, I mean, we did the Kelowna Accord. I think that what you've got to do is you've got to recognize the skills on the other side. When we did the Kelowna Accord, which essentially was dealt with this question about the shortfall in funding for education, healthcare, housing, and the way in which it operated is that we sat down with the provinces and with the First Nations and the Métis and the Inuit, and we did not say, this is your problem, now how are we going to solve it? We said, what are your problems? What are your priorities? And you tell us how you're going to solve them. And it worked marvelously well within an 18-month period, because they would have gone back and they consulted. We had really arrived at a plan that would have worked, and it is now what the current government, 10 years later, unfortunately, is going to try to put into place. It was really, in my opinion, the recognition that people can find their own answers if you give them the chance to do it. That's what the Grand Chief really, that's what his predecessors and what he's doing now.
Coming back to the theme of leadership, you had, Mr. Martin, a really tough assignment as finance minister. You inherited an economy which was in pretty rocky shape, and you had to take some very unpopular decisions, and you had to sell that to the country. Can you describe that process for a little bit? And can you perhaps comment on the role of a leader as a teacher or a mentor?
Well, okay, this is taking us slightly away from the main subject, but in 1993, when we took office, Canada had the highest debt to GDP ratio of any major industrial country. We had a deficit that, if interest rates went up by more than 3 percentage points, was going to be, we were Greece. And there was no doubt, and we also had the Canada Pension Plan at that point, had an unfunded liability greater than the national debt. So we were, to use a well-known financial economic term, we were in really deep doo-doo. And we had to act. And what acting meant was effectively cutting spending, and cutting spending deeply in areas that were very important to Canadians. So I went across the country for virtually a year, basically saying, this is what we're going to do, and let's talk about it. And that was a very important thing, going across the country and basically saying, let's talk about it. But the main message was, I give you my word that we'll cut today in order to preserve these programs. And when we get back into surplus, we will reinvest in those programs. And essentially, that was the debate that took place across the country. Were we in that big of trouble? And Canadians agreed that they were. Should you cut? Yes, you should cut. Now, the human problem of that problem is that you will be in favor of cutting spending until you find out that I'm going to cut something you want. And doesn't go over very well.
Yeah, but the newspaper said that the one exception to that was Indian affairs.
Yeah, that's right. And so what was crucial is that we cut everything. We had to cut everything so that nobody would think, oh my God, you know, I've gotten cut, but Sam's gotten away with nothing. Except for one issue, and that was spending on Indigenous issues. And that is the one thing we did not cut, but we did put a cap. We put a cap on the spending of 2%, but everything else got cut anywhere by 20%. But I also explained that to Canadians. And it was one of the first times there was a major debate in the country on Indigenous issues, because I had to explain that if we cut the problem was the Indigenous population was rising like this, so that even if you put a cap on, with about 4 or 5 years, you would be cutting spending because the population was growing. And so we explained that, and it all worked. 4 years later, we had eliminated the deficit. We started running surpluses. That's why when you talked about the healthcare, the biggest healthcare spending that has ever been done in Canada was our health package. But what we were really doing was keeping our word with Canadians, who said, when we get back into surplus, we're going to spend that money. Now, what happened was, unfortunately, that the cap stayed on. And then the election changed, the new government, and they kept the cap on for 10 years. And that cap really meant that every single year with the increase in population, the spending on Indigenous issues really was getting deeper and deeper into difficulty, which is why the current spending by the government is so badly needed.
Abel, I asked Mr. Martin those tough questions about tough decisions, because it seems to me that that's sort of the essence of leadership. You yourself were the point man on the Petit Brave, right? And there were some kind of controversial elements there as well. Did you see yourself in speaking with the communities in the role of a guide or a teacher or an educator? How did it work?
Good question. When former Grand Chief Ted Moses appointed me as the negotiator, you know, I was quite, first of all, surprised. But you know, we quickly got together a team and made out of Cree leaders and some former leaders and some young leaders, and we created these sub-teams for the different tables that we have created. As you recall, you know, we had all kinds of issues that were at stake. There was a hydroelectric project that was being proposed. There was a forestry issue that was an issue, and there was the issue of how do you implement the agreement? How does Quebec implement its obligations and so forth? And so we, through these teams, they went and they met with the Cree people. They came back and proposed some solutions, and it was done in a very short period. I mean, we have Paul John Murdoch here, who is working with Billy Diamond, and of course, and that was a good combination. A former leader working with the youth there in this process, and what they came up with in those set of agreements was pretty interesting. And in the area of forestry, of course, we had Romeo Saganas, who was from the community of Waswanipi. I mean, his community was experiencing clear cutting and so forth, so he was sort of the right person to be leading that. And so it was, you know, through just finding the right people within our small group there to lead these negotiations.
So in two very disparate areas, you're talking about the Petit Brave, and Mr. Martin's been talking about the budget, the deficit, and so on and so forth, but in both cases, leadership seems to be an exercise in consensus building or bringing people along somehow. Fair statement?
Fair statement.
So, it's about 5:45. Perhaps it's time now to ask participants if they have any questions or comments. Yes, sir. Please go to the mic. Yep.
So, Mr. Martin, you mentioned in two instances, once in the 90s about the debate over funding of Indigenous issues, and once recently after the conclusion of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, an attitudinal shift. So to what extent does bridging the cultural divide between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Canadians represent a solution to the potential pitfalls of Indigenous governance? And how can you create such a cultural connection considering the highly diverse nature of both Indigenous and non-Indigenous Canadians?
I actually spoke to the chairman and said, I hope that we can get involved in the issue of culture. So you're dead on. I think that I think it's crucial. And I think it's crucial for a number of reasons, not the least of which is that we are, again, going back to this question, we were talking about the youngest, the fastest growing segment of the population. More and more, they are getting a decent education, and they will do that more and more, right from primary school up through university. They are insisting that through the peace, that their culture be part, their culture and their languages be part of that, which is what they should be. And what I believe is going to be absolutely crucial is that we establish a new there has to be a new partnership between the Indigenous people of this country and the non-Indigenous people of this country. Otherwise, it's just not going to work. Now, I don't think that partnership, and I don't know if I'm addressing your question, but I'm trying to. I don't believe that partnership is going to be established if it's on the basis of you will know our culture, but we're going to ignore your culture. And don't kid yourself. Their culture there are some profound differences with ours that have got to be recognized. I mentioned one of them. This idea, all of us have been brought up to believe we are superior to nature, that we are above nature. That's not where the First Nations, that's not where the Indigenous people are coming from. We are part of nature. And that, obviously when you look at climate change, that is a fundamental shift. And that I think that there is an enormous amount that we can learn there. There are others. Yesterday, in the House of Commons, the Prime Minister stood up and apologized very emotionally for our failure to recognize the whole question of people who are gay, the whole transgender issue. Well, the fact of the matter is the Two-Spirit has been known among Indigenous people from the beginning of their time. And there is a huge degree of wisdom there and an approach. There's obviously far more spirituality at the present time than any of us have. And I think we have an enormous amount to learn. My worry will be if, in fact, as we proceed along the line, that it is only our perspective that counts. Because they are going to be a very large percentage of our population, and in my opinion, there is an enormous degree of wisdom in what they have to bring to the First Nations, the Métis, and the Inuit bring to the table. And let's not kid ourselves, there are differences between all three. And in fact, there are differences between the various communities. And so I think that if what you're saying is, can we bridge if we don't bridge these gaps, we don't have to bridge them in a way that says, well, okay, I'm just going to take what you think over. It has to be that we have to understand each other.
I think we've got a ways to go there, Mr. Martin. The Cree have worked over the past 2 years very hard to establish a commission of inquiry here in Quebec. It was precipitated by the Val d'Or incidents, the allegations of misconduct by police officers towards Indigenous women in Val-d'Or. And the Cree really spearheaded the effort to establish a commission of inquiry. We have heard things at that commission that would make your hair stand on end. And one of the comments that came out at the very beginning from Vivienne Michel, who is the leader of the Indigenous Women of Quebec, she said, "Ça me dépasse, ils ne considèrent pas comme des êtres humains." They don't see us as human beings. And, you know, it's such a striking, you know, a stark comment. And the people, the Cree here in the front row, can all tell stories about things that they've seen and observed. And we just, it seems to me, have a very long way to go in bringing about that kind of cultural change.
Yeah, your point is very well taken, but I will just say one thing. I've been imbued with this issue for a long time. This is actually the second time I've come to McGill. I think, and I feel really good about it, I think this is the first time anybody's asked me about bridging the cultures. I mean, I think that's a demonstration of the one heck of a shift that's occurring when somebody has picked it up. I don't remember being in a university where that question's been asked of me before you.
Hello, how's it going? This question is for Abel. I had the privilege of spending a month in OJ this summer, and I was wondering if you could speak to the housing issues. I mean, across the different communities. I understand that was a core part of your campaign. Yeah, as it was something that I certainly noticed I was with Frontier College running the literacy camp, so met a lot of I'm sure I had a lot of Bosums in the camp, so I'm sure I met a lot of your relatives. But yeah, I was wondering if you could speak to the state of housing among different Cree communities.
Well, Cree community housing is certainly an issue in the Cree communities and across Canada. It's probably one of the biggest issues, the biggest challenges that all Cree leaders and Indigenous leaders have. When I decided to run for Grand Chief, I saw that as an issue that we needed to deal with. And learning from the lessons that we have learned, from the other agreements, the governments will not find the answers for us. And so, our approach will be to propose a partnership. The Cree are ready to invest into housing, home ownership, for those who can afford to pay their homes, and then find another solution, for social housing. Because the program, the CMHC program that we are being offered, just does not work. It doesn't work today, and it needs to be fixed, replaced, and we think that the way to replace it is to allow us to develop the kind of housing program, the housing strategy that we need, so we can meet the needs of the various type of homes that are needed in our community. And I think that's really important, not only for members in the community, but we also have quite a number of post-secondary students who are out here studying, and of course we would like to get them home. We want to bring them home so they can work for us. And one of the obstacles is, of course, lodging, no housing in our communities. And so it is one thing that I want to do within my mandate, and hopefully finding homes for them will help them come home and be part of our nation building.
Yes, sir.
Thank you very much for being here, and for the people that organized this group. And I want to recognize the fact that we're on Indigenous territory with the Mohawk and Anishinaabe and Algonquin. Before I answer my question, there was a survey done in the Globe and Mail by Environics in terms of the attitude shift of Canadians after reconciliation. out of that report came out that there was 80% of non-Indigenous people that recognize the issues that you talked about, Mr. Martin, and a recognition that things need to be done on a whole lot of social and professional and education and housing. However, when it came down to economic development, that's where the split among non-Indigenous Canadians, where they can't seem to reconcile on how the mechanics of that would work. So my question to the panel is, do you have any ideas on how to bridge this gap, and how do we communicate that to, Indigenous people, especially around the boardrooms and within corporations, because that's where the rubber hits the road when it comes to development and governance.
Abel, could you start on that maybe with, don't want to put you on the spot here, but you have some experience in negotiating IBAs.
Yeah, well, I think there are maybe a few ways to do it. One is obviously building capacity, encouraging our young people to pursue certain careers related to resource development, so that we do have the engineers, the geologists, and all the specialists that we need, because we need to, even once the mines go up, it's important now we find our Indigenous people in those sites, in those workplaces, and that'll be one way of creating employment for communities. I think in the long term, if we can develop these professionals, and we do have geologists out there, and they're out there prospecting, I think they can go to a Cree guide and maybe find another outcrop somewhere. But there has to be also some, the industry also has to be involved in that. At the moment it appears that the industry is just taking everything out and not putting anything back. And this is kind of contrary to a Cree value. When we're brought up, we're told, take only what you need from the land and leave the rest there for the next generation. But of course, we have industries that are hungry, and they'll just extract everything and as quickly as they can, make their money as quickly as they can, and then they leave an empty hole and a mess. And so there's a need to fix that. And I guess it's through these negotiations with the industries. And we've had some experience with IBAs, and we have 4 of them, and each one we're trying to improve on. In those IBAs, we try to incorporate the values that the Cree are expecting from that agreement. We're putting in place all kinds of environmental measures to make sure that the companies are not destroying the land. And then, of course, we're working on ways in which the Cree can benefit from resource development.
So, in fact, you're talking about moving back towards partnership, are you not?
Right.
Yeah. Do you see a shift in boardrooms towards accepting this kind of partnership?
Well, it's going to have to be, or you're not going to have it. It is as simple as that. I think that. First of all, I think the Grand Chief has answered it really quite well. There is going to be development. It's got to take, but nonetheless, that development cannot take place on the basis of that so much of the development has taken place before. I mean, you've seen there was the article in the paper the other day about the province of Ontario 25 years ago ignoring the fact that there was mercury poisoning. In fact, when they knew it, where the study was there, and they basically hid the fact that there was mercury poisoning in grassy narrows. So I don't think that anybody is saying that if there is going to be development, that it can take place on some of the developmental rules that have been established over the course of the last 100 years. Those days are over. But on the other hand, when essentially, and I found this in talking to younger people, and I think what you said, give us the engineers, let us have, if we have these kinds of people, that you will see the development, but it'll take place on a very very different, differing basis. When I was the finance minister, I actually tried to get depletion put in at much stronger depletion on a real basis into development. And there was a hell of a fight. And I didn't do it on the basis that I was doing this to protect Indian First Nations communities. I did it on the basis that depletion is an accounting term, for God's sake, and let's do it properly. And we were not doing it properly. So I think this can be handled. I think there are projects that they're not going to go ahead because of these kinds of things. But we do have a little bit of trouble with the planet right now, and I think we've got to take that into account. But I think that the answer that the chief gave which is, look, once we have these kinds of skills in our hands. The other thing I think that business has got to understand, and it's not, by the way, this is not just resource development. I mean, let's just give you an example. I mean, you know it as well as I do. The economy is changing fundamentally. But most of these northern communities still don't have connectivity. So, I mean, how the heck there's going to be a lot of development that's going to take place through connectivity, areas which your generation understands a lot better than ours does. Mine does, and yours, and you don't want to come into it. But, and I think that's also the kind of development that we're going to have to take a look at.
We're just about 6 o'clock, but I think we have time for one question. Please go ahead, sir.
It's going to be quick. So tonight's conference was organized jointly with the Faculty of Management, and the theme was about governance and development. So I was wondering if you could tell a little more about some Cree entrepreneurial successes and how you are developing the economy in the north of Quebec, and not only just partnering with bigger companies coming and drilling a hole, then going back, but how you're building new things yourself and within your communities. And if you could just give us examples of that, like this building, for example, was it built locally or,
Well, we have an organization called CREECO, which is the Cree Regional Economic Enterprise, all right? And it's a subsidiary of a series of business ventures that we have. We have an airline that flies from Montreal up north. I don't know how many fleets we have, about 100? 19 planes servicing the north. And of course, initially it was just transportation into the communities, and now they've been able to expand their service. They're servicing the mines, so they're chartered services and so forth. And then the other new development, of course, was in the health sector. We have a high number of patients, that need to be transported in the south. So there's a separate charter, in fact, 2 charters, for the health. So the airline is doing well. We do have a regional construction company. All the communities, they all have development corporations, and they're into all kinds of construction, mining, forestry. So it's really slowly picking up. The business mentality is something new for us. Because our elders, it was about sharing. It was about sharing everything you have. You can't do that in business, otherwise you go bankrupt. So this is a new challenge. But yes, I think there's a lot of young people now who are studying, taking business administration and so forth, and are now starting their own businesses.
Bravo. Well, I think that's it for the questions. I'd like to, we have one more. Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Lyle Kitchen. I'm from the Cree community of Nimska, and I guess I'm asking this small question to Abel Bosum and maybe the executive workers of the Grand Council. I guess considering all the economic developments that the Eeyou have gone through, and the airlines, also the mining agreements that we made over the years. Do you think, like, I guess if I'm looking into, I guess toward 30, 50 years in the future, I guess, do you think that USG, the people of USG, are on a path to becoming their own independent state, independent nation? Just a little.
Well, well, let me put it this way.
As your lawyer, you don't have to answer.
Good one, John. Well, let me put it this way. I think that the Cree Nation is, their mission is to decolonize and to push towards self-autonomy. All right, and to develop partnership with with Quebec and with Canada. And I think that if we can do that, we will be able to develop a stronger economy in our communities, in our regions, in the province, and in Canada. So as I think by working together that we will all benefit, and there'll be a win-win at the end of in 15, 20 years from now. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Yes, my name is Gerben Oegem. I'm the director of the Center for Research on Religion, and I'm here to thank Grand Chief Abel Bosum, the Right Honourable Paul Martin, Dr. John Hurley for their contribution to this afternoon discussion. As it has already been noted several times, this is our Aboriginal ground. And on the middle of it is the Hokalaka Stone, which is a symbol of a meeting place of people's mindsets and cultures since 350 years. A very difficult history and relationship, but I think that your discussion has shown that a new page has been turned. And for that we want to thank you. We didn't bring you a present like chocolate or flowers, but I think the only real present we can make, all of us, is to take this discussion serious and to contribute to it also in the future. Please join me for an applause.